if you go out on a night when the moon is full and you come to a clearing and you find a lake there, beware. For though the water might be cool and still, from up out of the very centre of that lake, the lady of the lake will rise up, and she will fix you with her steely gaze, and she will beckon to you, and you will be powerless to resist her. Soon you'll be wading into the icy cold waters, and they will lap around your ankles and your calves and then your knees and then around your waist, and then they will envelop your entire body, and you'll be swimming out to her until finally she has you in her grasp, and she will dive down deep into the depths of that lake, and no one will ever see you again. Once there was a king and a queen, and the queen had wanted a child for many, many years, but for some reason she hadn't been fortunate enough to have a child. But then, after many years of trying, one day she felt a change, and she realised she was with child, and 9 months later she gave birth to a baby boy, and how husband and wife they rejoiced. Well, he was an only child, and so from the very, very beginning, he was terribly spoilt. It was decided that each and every gift he was given should be a gift of gold. And so the first spoon he ate with was a spoon of the purest gold. The first rattle he shook was a rattle of the purest gold. And from that day onwards, every gift he was given always had to be a gift of gold. Many years had passed. He'd grown up to be healthy. He'd also grown up to be very spoilt. On his 18th birthday, there he was. He was sitting in the throne room, upon his father's throne, and he was awaiting all his guests. And they were standing outside in a long queue. And they were all fearful of how the prince would respond to the gifts they were about to give him. For each and every one of them had to bring a gift of gold. And it was difficult after all this time to do such a thing. Well, they would be ushered in, they'd pass the gift to the prince, he'd rip off the paper, and he'd look at it and he'd say, "I have one of these already." And he'd go walking over to the window, and he'd fling it out of the window, out into the night. And so it was that a beautiful bowl of gold was thrown out of the window, a beautiful fiddle was thrown, and a beautiful knife, a sharp, sharp knife. Now outside, looking up at the window, looking for some sign of her beloved, was a young peasant girl. She'd seen the prince and she'd loved him for many, many years. And she waited for each time he came to the window. And each and every time he threw something out of the window, it would land upon the ground at her feet, and she would pick it up out of the snow, and she would clutch it to her breast. And so it was that she'd picked up a bowl of gold, a fiddle of gold, and a knife of gold. But because it was cold outside on that night, she'd cut her finger when she picked up the dagger, and little drips of blood had dropped into the snow. The prince had grown weary of receiving the gifts he didn't want, and he'd gone out to look out into the night when he saw this young girl, and he was curious about her. And even in the half-light, he thought he could see what looked like droplets of blood in the snow. And he said, "Have I hurt you in some way?" And she looked up and she said, "In ways you cannot really understand." And with that, she turned on her heel and she walked away. The prince was confused. He left the throne room. He stomped down the corridor. He went into his own room and he slammed the door shut. How he was sick of that day. He thought, I haven't been given anything I don't already possess. As he sat there sulking, there was a knocking at the door, and he got up and he went to the door, and there stood the strangest woman. Her name was the Princess Bobolink. She had piercing eyes like the eyes of an eagle. She had a long crooked nose, and upon the end of that nose a wart, and growing out of that wart 7 greasy hairs. And she said, "Ah, nephew, have you been given some beautiful gifts this day?" And he said, "I've not been given anything I don't already possess. Do you have something for me?" And she said, "Indeed I do. Take this." And she passed him a book that was wrapped in brown paper, covered in cobwebs. And he looked at it, and he was about to go over to the window and fling it out, and she said, "Stop, stop, this is no ordinary book. Inside that brown wrapping paper is a book of spells and incantations, the likes of which you will have never read." And so he went over to the table. He sat down at the table without a word of thanks, and he began to leaf through the book. And he read about how you could harvest fungi in the forest, and how you could turn these toadstools and mushrooms into all manner of precious things to eat. And he thought, I have everything I wish to eat already. Why should I want to go to the trouble of going out in the morning to fetch fungi? He read on. He read about how, if you were out early, you might see the dewdrops there, hanging off the branches of the trees. And it said if you collected that dew, you could turn those little droplets of dew into all manner of gemstones, diamonds and rubies and emeralds. And he thought, I have all these things already. This book is actually rather tiresome, just like everything else in my life. He leafed through a few more pages, and then he saw something that drew his attention. For written on the page it said, "The Lady of the Lake," and scrawled over that page in red were the words, "Do not open, beware." Well, of course, when you're told not to do something, you can't resist it, can you? The temptation was so great, he got a knife, he warmed it over a candle, and he cut open the seal of wax which had held the 2 pages together, and then he turned the page over, and there, on the left-hand side was a dancing image, an image of a woman rising up out of a lake and beckoning to him. And on the other page was writing, and it said, "The Lady of the Lake. No one knows whether it be a myth or whether it be the truth, but it's said that on nights when the moon is full, the Lady of the Lake rises up out of the water, and when she fixes you with her steely gaze, you will be powerless. And it's said that no one who has ever seen her has lived to tell the tale." This I've got to see. She I need to meet. "Servants, servants!" he called to his servants. In came a servant. He said, Tell me, is the moon full tonight?" "Yes, your majesty." Well, fetch me my coat of ermine. I wish to go out." His ermine coat was brought. He threw it over his shoulders. He walked down the corridor, down the spiral staircase, and out into the night. It was a bright, clear night. It was no longer snowing, and he could see footprints in the snow and tiny little droplets of blood. Not knowing which way to go, he decided he'd follow those footprints, for he was certain they must belong to that girl. And so he followed the footprints until he came to a little cottage on the edge of the forest. And there was a little light, a candlelight flickering there in the window. And he went to the door and he knocked. He waited. And then the door was opened and there she stood and she said, "Oh, it's you. Why are you here?" "I've come to see the Lady of the Lake." "That's not a good idea. You really shouldn't go there. Please don't. I wish to see her. She's the only thing I know nothing of." Don't you know where I can find her? No. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you. I'm cold. Let me in. Let me in to warm myself beside your fire. Let me in to warm myself in your bed. No, I can't let you in. You're a stranger to me. Besides which, my parents are asleep and I'd need to ask them. Besides which, if you wanted to lay in my bed, I would need to know that you cared for me, that you loved me. And he looked at her, and she was very beautiful. And he said, "Oh, but I do. I do love you." The truth was, he hadn't yet learned to love anyone other than himself. And she said, "Well, if you really love me, you'll be willing to stand out here for 15 minutes to prove your love. But I don't think you could." Of course I can. A man such as me, I stand outside for 15 minutes, that'll be easy. She shut the door on him. He stood there for 5 minutes. His fingers and toes grew colder and colder. He stood there for 10 minutes. The blood in his very body seemed to be freezing. After 11 minutes, he thought, what am I doing? Why am I standing here, outside the door of a peasant girl's house? This is ridiculous. I'm going home. But while he'd been waiting, the snow had continued to fall, and now he couldn't see the footprints he'd followed before. He wandered off, but he was getting more and more lost. Eventually, he realised he didn't know where he was. He began to fear for his life. "Mother, father, where are you? Where are you? Servants, come to my aid. I'm weary. I'm weary. I need your aid." But no one was there. He was all alone, and he was growing weaker and weaker by the minute. Hypothermia was soon going to overtake him. But then he staggered out of the woods and he came to a clearing. And there in front of him was a cool, still lake. And he stood there as the moon shone down and ripples danced across the surface of the lake. Then up, out of the water rose the lady of the lake, and she fixed him with her steely gaze, and she beckoned him, and he began to wade into the water. It was so cold. It lapped around his ankles, around his calves, and then around his knees. It lapped around his waist and then his chest, and then he was swimming out towards her. And then she embraced him in her arms, and she dove deep, deep, deep down into the water. The next morning there was pandemonium in the palace. The servant had gone to take the prince his early morning cup of tea, and there was no sign of him. All of the servants were quizzed. And one said, "Well, he went out. He asked for his ermine coat." And the king said, "Messengers must be sent out to each and every corner of the kingdom to find the prince." And so men rode out to the north and the east and the south and the west, but nobody knew anything of the prince. And wise men were called upon, and the king said, tell me what has happened to the prince." And the first wise man stroked his beard and said, "It's quite simple, your majesty. The prince was out walking, and he has fallen into the river, and he's been turned into the salmon of knowledge, your majesty." And the king shook his head in dismay. But just then a young woman burst into the throne room, and she was carrying something beneath her cloak. And the king said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am a maiden who loves your son, and I know where he is." "Tell me, where is he?" "He's with the lady of the lake." "I've never heard of her." "He's in danger, and only I can save him." She then let the 3 objects drop to the floor, and he said, "How did you come by these things?" She said, "The prince, he threw them away, and I picked them up out of love for him, for they are as precious to me as he is. But I will bring him back." "I wish you Godspeed," said the king. And she picked up the bowl, she picked up the fiddle, she picked up the dagger, and she headed out into the woods. And she carried on walking through the woods until finally she came to the lake. And there she stood, and she wondered what she could do to bring the prince back. And then she knelt down, and she got the bowl, and she began to bail out water. And it was so cold. And she continued bailing for a while, and then she thought she could see a tunnel down into the depth of the lake. But she wasn't certain how she could descend into the depths of it. And so she picked up the fiddle and she began to play the fiddle, and the most haunting melody filled the air. And then steps began to appear down into the lake, and she walked down. And as she did, the air was so cold, it nearly froze the very breath in her body. And down she walked until she came to a great icy door, but there was no handle on it, and she didn't know how to enter. And then she thought, I must use a dagger. And she pulled it out, and she breathed on it. And then she carved a great archway into that ice, and she pushed, and the door fell down to the ground, and it shattered into a million shards, and they danced across the surface of the great chamber in the centre of the lake. And she started walking along towards the lady, for there was the lady, and in her arms was the prince, and his face was deathly white. Only a little red showed on his lips. And the lady of the lake said, "Why are you here?" "I've come for him. I've come for the prince, for I love him." "You love him, do you? Well, if you love him, the only way you can set him free is if you will hold on to my arm until it thaws. But you will have to do that for a full 15 minutes, and I do not believe that your love is strong enough." "It is. I will do it." And she approached the lady of the lake, and she reached out and she put her hands onto the arms of the lady of the lake. And she stood there, and she could feel the cold seeping up her fingers, the cold beginning to run through the blood that pulsed through her body. She grew colder and colder minute by minute. And the lady of the lake said, "Look at me." "No, I can only look at him, for only then can I stand the pain I am feeling." And she held on, and she looked at the prince's face for any signs of life. She looked for the flicker in an eyelash, some movement in his lips, but she saw none, and still she clung on. The lady of the lake said, "Look at me." "No, I can only look at him." And now she was beginning to freeze. She felt the very life in her was ebbing away, and she looked at the prince, and she saw his eyelash move for one moment, but then she saw no more. The prince awoke. He freed himself of the lady of the lake. He picked up the girl and he carried her the length of that chamber, up the steps and on through the forest, until finally he came to his palace, and there he lay her down on a couch in front of a blazing, crackling fire. And then he knelt down before her and he waited until a little colour returned to her cheek, a little breath returned to her breast, and he looked at her and he said, You have saved my life. You have taught me what love is. Will you marry me?" And she couldn't yet find the words to speak, but she nodded. And if anyone doubt that this tale be true, all you need to do is to go to that palace, for there in the entrance hall, you will see 3 velvet cushions. And upon one of them, you'll see a bowl of gold. Upon a second, you'll see a fiddle of gold. And upon the third, you'll see a knife of gold.